Okay, we're going to take a look at some strategy and tactics for the game Mr. Madison's War that has just been released there by GMT. Now, for those of you who have the game, don't be concerned about the map here. This map I have is well, a later prototype, so the colors and the logo is missing on this map. Don't panic. Your map may look a little different, but for the purposes of this video, this map will be fine for showing you some of the concepts. And what I'm going to do is show you some opening moves, some ways of moving the men and the troops that are not self-evident when you play your first game. So we're going to begin the video by looking at the situation there on the Detroit frontier, and we'll zoom in and I'll show you some typical moves there. Okay, that's the game setup for the US and British forces in the West. Now, when Congress declared war on Great Britain on June 18th, Hull's army was actually in transit on its march to Detroit. He actually had to cut a new road through northern Ohio, being wilderness. So on June 18th, the idea was that when the US declared war, Hull would take his army, march up to Detroit, and cross over and invade Canada. Almost like what the Japanese had planned in World War II. The idea was that they would declare war and attack Pearl Harbor right after. As it turned out, that isn't what happened. The attack went in before the formal declaration, which makes it look like a real sneak attack, which it was, but it was not intended that way. And that was the idea behind this. The idea was that they would declare war and Hull would invade the province of Upper Canada. Now, in the game, Mr. Madison's War, I've got a special opening, a pre-war phase, where there are a draw deck of 14 cards, and you don't know when the declaration of war comes up. That was to simulate this very aspect of the war. Because in real life, when Hull was marching north to Detroit, the British actually found out about the declaration of war before Hull did. And poor old General Hull put all his baggage and supplies on a schooner, had it go up to Detroit, but it was captured on Lake Erie by the British. So the British knew all of Hull's plans, his order of battle, his whole plan of campaign. So Mr. Hull was having a bad day. Anyway, for game purposes, a typical opening for the American commander is playing a 2 card, let's say, like that, because Hull's activation value is 2, and just marching him up to Detroit like this. 2, 4, 6 points. That's quite a common move, and we all did it when we were first learning the game. But it's not the best move, because that's the historical move, Hull moving up to Detroit. But historically, the Indian leader Tecumseh, along with some British parties, began to interdict Hull's supply lines, and that's reflected in the Tecumseh attacks supply line card. So if the American player marches straight to Detroit, he's vulnerable along the lake shore. Why is he? It's because the British are kind of in control of the lake, de facto control, because the Americans only have the single brig Adams at Detroit, while the British here have the Queen Charlotte and the Hunter at Fort Malden, plus 2 other vessels at Port Dover. So it's only a hop, skip, and a jump for the British to control Lake Erie. So that's not a good move, leaving your supply line open. What could happen then is Tecumseh could use that card, if the British gets it, ports over to, let's say, Frenchtown or Brownstown, and starts to interdict Hull's supply line. Now, Hull is still supplied when nobody controls the lake. But if the British place their vessels in the lake control box, they now control the lake. And now Hull's supply line is cut. He can't trace overland because of Tecumseh, and he can't trace over the lake because of the British vessels. So I'm going to demonstrate a better move that Hull can do. One thing players should get in the habit of doing is using their generals to activate forces, because that's the most efficient way to move troops. Now in the game, if you play a 2 card, for example, you could move 2 individual units. So Hull could move 2 units from this square. But that's the most inefficient way to move troops. A much better way is to activate Hull himself. And leaders have 10 movement points. So here's a better move. Hull, you activate Hull. He spends 2 movement points to go to Lower Sandusky. Picks up that unit, which doesn't cost anything. Moves back to the Maumee Rapids. And then starts to move up to Detroit. Now keep in mind that the unit he picked up here can only move 2 movement points. So that unit would go 2, 4, that's as far as he can go as Brownstown. So Hull could march north, drop off a unit, march to Brownstown, drop off a unit, and then march to Detroit. And he'd even have what? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. No, that would be the end of Hull's move. But you can see it's a much better move. He's now moved to Detroit in force, and he's protected his supply line. It can't be easily interdicted by the British. Now, yes, his army is smaller, but at least it's in a better position than it would have been before. Let's look at some other alternative moves for the American player. Okay, another alternative move for the US player would be to build a supply depot early on in the game. And you can do this by expending a card of any value. Of course, here's a good opportunity to get rid of a 1 card. So he could play this 1 operations card and build a supply depot at Detroit. Now, even if the British interdict Frenchtown and Brownstown, any force at Detroit will be supplied. Supply depots work in both directions, so technically we go this direction and that direction. Now, building the supply depot without having an army there is a little risky, because Proctor could move up here and possibly lay siege to Detroit. Now, Detroit's defense is 6, and it's like a 6B. Proctor doesn't have a lot of forces there to lay siege to Detroit. He's got the Indians, but remember, the Indians are very fragile. The Shawnee unit has a flip side, but the Wyandotte unit does not. So the Indian units, though very valuable, are extremely fragile, and the British don't have it all their way. So that's another alternative for an opening, building a supply depot at Detroit. Now, if the American wants to be very patient, of course he can always take Hull and march down to pick up all the Ohio detachments here along the lakeshore. So he could go 2, 4, pick them up, 6, 8, and then move a larger army up to Detroit. So there's all kinds of different openings the Americans can explore in the West. The one you have to watch out for is the direct march on Detroit, as I've pointed out, because you're leaving your supply lines kind of open. So let's look at some other tactics in the game, or strategies rather. Okay, here's some tips for the British and the Americans on the Lake Ontario front. Now, the main U.S. naval base on Lake Ontario is Sackett's Harbor. And at the beginning of 1812, the first turn of the game, it's very vulnerable because it's only protected by the 4th New York Militia. And this fort does not exist until the second half. So the defense of Sackett's Harbor, his main naval base, is defended by a 4C unit. Now, for the British, the situation is similar. Kingston's fortifications are not finished in the first half of 1812, and it's defended by a 3C unit and a 3B. So both Sackett's Harbor and Kingston are very vulnerable, and my advice to both players, US and British, is to protect them at all costs. You do not want to lose your naval base, and for the British, losing Kingston would be disastrous. Now, the situation on Lake Ontario is a bit different than on the Lake Erie front. Similar, but a little bit different. Now, the British have 2 vessels here at Kingston, the Sir Sidney Smith schooner and the Royal George corvette. Now, they also have at York several vessels, the Gloucester schooner, the Earl of Moira brig, and the Beresford. So, on a cursory examination, it looks as if the British are very powerful on the lake, and they are. But they also have some severe limitations. And this is because it's not possible for them to move all their vessels onto the lake at one time. Why? It's because they have no naval leader. So to move the Sir Sidney Smith and the Royal George out onto the lake for lake control, they'd have to burn up a 2 card. And that can be expensive. So burning up a 2 card will allow that. But if they wanted to move the other two vessels, or rather three, onto Lake Erie, or Lake Ontario, they'd have to use a 3 card. Why? Because it takes a 3 card to move 3 units. So that could be a very expensive proposition. Granted, it would put them in total lake control, because the Americans could not contest the lake with a single brig Oneida. But it's an expensive use of cards for securing the lake, but still possible. So in the opening months of 1812, the Americans are going to have to be content with not really controlling Lake Ontario. But fortunately, with no naval leader, the British can't really exploit it. They'll have a heck of a time doing amphibious moves into Genesee or Sodus or Oswego or Sandy Creek. It's possible, but it would be rather expensive. I'll give you an example of an amphibious move, for example. If the British player played a 2 card, he could activate 2 units from Kingston. Those two units being the Royal George corvette and, let's say, the 10th Royal Veterans. That's an amphibious move, and it's quite legal without a leader. The naval unit would pick up the land unit, 1 movement point, sail to Oswego, 2 movement points, and drop the unit off, 3 movement points. And of course they would capture Oswego for 2 victory points. But that's a very bold and risky move. Why? Well, they're leaving Kingston wide open, which isn't good, and it's for questionable victory points and of a temporary nature. Still, it's a bold move, something you may want to consider, but the British always must keep in mind the St. Lawrence River line. They have to secure this river line. They just cannot let it fall under American control. For example, if this New York militia unit got onto the Gananoque Square, it would be a disaster for every British unit to the west. They would all be cut off because the supply line has to go back to Quebec City on the eastern edge of the map. Now, just like the example with General Hull, the British could alleviate that problem by building a depot, let's say at York, for example. But you have to build a depot while you're still in supply. So it's something you have to think about well in advance. But for the British, the rule of thumb should be never let a U.S. unit get onto the St. Lawrence supply line. They must keep that supply line open. Okay, I'm going to show you a typical move the U.S. player can do in the second half of 1812. That's after the fortifications at Sackett's Harbor and Kingston are completed. Remember, they're completed in the fall of 1812. So in the fall of 1812, Sackett's Harbor's defense is 8 plus any units with them. Kingston's defense is 8 plus any units with them. But I want to show you the power of a naval leader, what you can do with a naval leader, and it's pretty powerful. Now Chauncey, for example, needs a 2 to activate him. So let's say the American player plays a 2 card to activate Chauncey. This is what Chauncey can do, and that's why the British have to be very careful about their supply line. So Chauncey is activated for 2. He can pick up Forsyth's rifles. Why? Because the brig Oneida can carry him. So he picks up Forsyth's rifles for 1 point, sails to Gananoque for 2 points, drops off Forsyth's rifles for 3, and he's interdicted the British supply line. In fact, if the British had left Prescott open, which in this case they did, he could actually drop him off at Prescott. He would now be in a defense position of 3 plus 2 is 5, and he's an A-class unit. That is going to be one tough nut to crack for the British to oust him. So that's something you can do with a naval leader. He makes amphibious moves a lot easier. And in this example, which isn't the best one, the British should have been keeping their supply line closed. They always have to be aware of that. Now I'll show you another move that Chauncey can do. Again, showing the power of a naval commander. So we activate Chauncey with the operations point card of 2. He takes his vessels and sails to Oswego, 1 movement point. Picks up these vessels, 2 movement points. Sails to Ogdensburg, 3 movement points. and then sails into the lake control box and takes control of the lake. So in one single move with one card, Chauncey has gathered every single naval vessel he has, gone onto the lake control box, and then of course will get the 2 victory points and be in complete control of the lake. That's why naval leaders are so important. They allow you to do amphibious moves more efficiently, transport moves more efficiently, and gather their ships more efficiently. Not like the British situation that we described before, where with, yes, the British has 3 ships at York, but he can't move them efficiently. He needs a 3 card just to move them. Now let's say for the sake of argument, the British does have a 3 card, and he decides to take on Chauncey. So the British player plays a 3 card to activate those 3 units, and he decides to sail out into the lake with the 3 schooners. Now we have our first naval battle, and we'll show you how that works and why this isn't a particularly good move. Now I show you this move just to show you a typical naval battle, but it's not a move I would recommend the British to do. In this case we've got 3 vessels attacking 7 vessels. So the modifiers would be -1 for the British, because they don't have a leader. Chauncey's a +1. And -2 because the Americans have twice as many vessels as the British. So the British are starting off in a naval combat with -3 to the die roll. So we check the naval combat results table, roll the die. 3, the -3 is a 0. Attacker strikes his flag, all ships removed permanently. So total defeat for the British. So in other words, don't go into a battle, naval battle with negative modifiers. It can get very ugly. So that's a typical naval battle, not necessarily a representative one. Now, I'm going to keep the video short. I'm going to end it here. I just wanted to show you a couple of tactics and a couple of moves in the game. Depending on the response, I'll maybe do some more videos. But it's just to give you an idea of what the game is like for those of you who play card-driven games. I hope you enjoyed the video. So long.